All right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us here for today's Diversity Dialogues. We are going to be presenting Summer of Discontent, Lessons Learned, Looking Ahead. Thank you to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Dr. Terrence Mitchell for hosting this session today. I just want to do some quick introductions for what we're going to be discussing and some backgrounds of our panelists for today. So today we're going to be talking about our reflections on this past summer and some of the events that happened, and also looking forward ahead to what this year may bring. Each panelist will be speaking from their disciplinary perspective about what happened over the summer and some of the ramifications for the rest of this year and into 2021. We'll start off with Dr. Julian Field, an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling, School Psychology, and Special Education. Dr. Field has worked as a counseling professor for the last 17 years at 3 different universities. She has also worked as a licensed professional counselor in three different states since 1995. And those positions include school counseling, mental health, private practice, crisis and trauma work with K through 12 students, and survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and childhood sexual abuse. Dr. Sheila Lorenzo de la Pena, assistant professor with the art therapy program at Edinburgh University. She promotes routine use of creative expressions for self-care and resiliency for faculty, clinicians, students, and supervisees. She maintains several creative practices and shares them through social media. You can find her on Instagram at Sacred Arts, that's SACRED ARTZ, and campus-wide activities such as the virtual open studio. Dr. Adrian Dixon serves as the program head and associate professor for the counseling program here at Edinburgh. She holds a PhD in counseling psychology and a postmaster's certificate in marital and family therapy. She has 30 years of clinical experience as a professional counselor and administrator. Her areas of focus have centered on working with serious mental illness in settings that include inpatient, residential treatment, and also substance abuse and outpatient services. Our final panelist, Dr. Jim Fisher, is a professor of politics and legal studies in the departments of history, politics, languages, and cultures. He is also the pre-law advisor here at Edinburgh. Since 2000, he has been teaching courses focused on American politics, law and politics, and political theory. He is particularly interested in reproductive politics, First Amendment rights, and civil discussion of controversial issues. Before I turn it over to Dr. Terrence Mitchell from the Center of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I just wanted to point out a couple things. We will be having the live chat feature available on our YouTube channel. So if you want to head over here, or I guess since you're watching, you're already there, you can enter a comment or you can ask a question for one of our panelists. We will be talking about some sensitive issues. So we will have staff members from our Gehring Health Center available if anybody needs to talk following this presentation. And all of our presenters here today they're available through email if you want to search through our Edinburgh directory for contact information. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Terrence Mitchell, who's going to give a little bit of an introduction and a little background to what we're doing, and then we will go forth with our presenters. So thank you very much for joining us. This will be recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel, and we will also make it available on our social media channels too. So if you missed today's session, or if you want to revisit to get some information, it will be available for you. So without further ado, here's Dr. Terrence Mitchell.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm excited about this opportunity to discuss this summer with you. I want to thank first Chris LaFloria and Jim Fisher for helping me get this together. We spent months talking about ways that we could reach out to the community and the community could have some voice in this summer. On many campuses, people are trying to wrap their brains around this very unusual summer in higher education. I think this is a great opportunity for us to engage around this important discussion around diversity and inclusion. I've been doing this work for 30 years, and this has been a unique time for us. For those of us who are chief diversity officers and those of us who do diversity work, it's difficult to wrap our brains around multiple stressors that have been presented this summer: COVID-19, the death of George Floyd, the resulting protests, political unrest, and also those things we've been dealing with daily with staying at home. I have a 20-year-old daughter. Getting to know your family again in such an intimate way. It's all added stresses, and one thing I've always been concerned about is that how the stack of stressors impact our lives. Doing this work for 30 years, we've gone through phases of our diversity work. We've had joyful times and we've had times that have been uncomfortable. Jim Fisher suggested calling this a summer of discontent. I think that's an adequate title. This has been a summer where we've all had to test ourselves and test others and see what's going on. I think that we're gonna have a great discussion today. I've talked to some colleagues in Pittsburgh yesterday, and on all their campuses, they're doing the same thing. I think all around the country, we're having great discussions. I imagine that we're gonna emerge from this time healthier, a little bit wiser about who we are as a nation and who we are in higher education. I asked this panel because I like to believe that we have on our campus scholars who can help us through difficult times, and this is a very good panel. All four of the people I've worked with before, they're very smart people, and they're going to take us through a great discussion. I'd like to thank them again, and then also ask Dr. Julian Field, if she would, Jelaine Field, to begin the discussion for us. Thank you again for joining us.
Terrence and everyone, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I really feel honored that I have the opportunity to talk with all of you and to talk with the people who are in this session with us today. I'm coming at this from a mental health perspective, and what's been really interesting for me to observe is how people in the helping professions, meaning psychologists, counselors, and social workers, art therapists, how we've all been grappling with what to call this phenomenon that we are experiencing. And I think that we have struggled with an adequate name to describe what many of us have been immersed in the last few months or in this summer of discontent. And one term that I have heard, which I find interesting, that I'm exploring further, is called collective complex trauma. Collective complex trauma. So just to break that down very quickly, collective meaning that the circumstances that we find ourselves in are impacting our global community, especially with COVID-19. We have circumstances that are impacting our national community, and then also affecting our local community as well. I use the word complex because we have multiple things happening simultaneously that make things quite complicated. For one, and I've actually heard the term tridemic versus pandemic to describe these circumstances. So tridemic meaning one is COVID-19 and watching the numbers of people impacted by this illness or having death in their family as a result of this illness. The second leg would be the astounding racial injustice and the systemic racism that we are witnessing through examples of police brutality and other circumstances that are happening. And then the third part of that tridemic is the economic crisis that our country and other countries across the world find themselves in because of COVID-19. It's important, I think, to recognize that unemployment is linked to a whole host of mental health issues, including suicide, more inpatient hospitalizations, homicide, and stress-related disorders. So that's collective and complex. And then finally, the word trauma. I think that many people, if they look at the definition that trauma can cause us to be in a psychic or a behaviorally altered state other than what we were before the events. I think that trauma does fit for some people and that they have experienced trauma as a result that everything is as a result of everything that's happening. Some people who don't identify with the word trauma probably identify with the word stress, just like Terrence indicated. And many of us have experienced a cascade of stressors over the past few months or an accumulation of stressful events. Because I'm a researcher, I felt like I needed to go out there and just see what statistics relate to some of this phenomena that we're describing. So just this past summer, the Center for Disease Control did a study with 5,000 participants. It was a nationwide study, and it happened between June 24th and June 30th. And these are some of the statistics that they found related to mental health. So 40.9% of the respondents reported at least one adverse mental health or behavioral health condition, which include criteria that sounded like an anxiety disorder. 30.9% reported criteria that related to a depressive disorder. 26.3% of the participants reported trauma or stress disorder type symptoms. 13.3% said that they either started using substances or increased their use of substances to help them cope with all of the stressors that they had in their lives. And the next one, 10.7% of the respondents who are between the ages of 18 and 24 reported serious suicidal ideation within the previous 30 days of taking the survey. So there are many aspects of these statistics that we could focus on today. And because there are 3 mental health professionals on this panel, we thought we would divide things up a bit. And I've really been focusing on the role of relationship and how fractured relationships have exacerbated some of the symptoms and some of the experiences that we're having. And at the same time, being able to lean into relationship and ask for help has also helped sustain us in these particular circumstances. So we know that many people are experiencing a level of social disconnect that is exacerbating their stress symptoms. For heaven's sakes, we're using the term social distancing all of the time. And for some people, social distancing means less social support than what they had before. Our sense of attachment to others has been compromised for some people. Social distancing has meant separation from support, or the separation from some of those relationships that give us a sense of purpose and meaning. And racial injustice has caused us to question how we can belong to a country where individuals can justify such disparities in human rights. And then finally, economic angst or despair may be straining our relationships or our emotional capacity to retain quality relationships. So as a mental health professional, I believe that we are neurobiologically wired to be in relationship, and that quality relationships may be part of what is going to heal us locally, nationally, as well as globally from this summer of discontent. I look forward to your questions and look forward to talking more about these issues.
So I'd like to just piggyback onto what Dr. Field added. I mean, I shouldn't say I love, but the term tridemic really does sum it up. And you look at, again, the complexity of all of these factors happening at the same time, from COVID-19 to the racial disparity, and certainly all of this economic challenges and stress that was created. You know, these past several months have created or moved us in very critical times, or a critical moment in the space of time. And it really has allowed us to begin to think critically about what are the ripples and what will be the ripples down the road. And the focus that I wanted to look at, or that I wanted to bring to the discussion today around mental health, was about social justice. And it's important in terms of, as we're watching all of these things go through, and Jelaine talked about trauma and what particularly complex trauma brings. And when we look at all of our exposure to potentially adverse experiences in life, that one of the things we know about feeling resilient and being able to move forward is when we can make meaning out of what our experiences has been, and when we can bring and have an understanding about that. And when we can't, it leaves us in this unsafe and feeling disempowered and helpless perspective, which really fuels lots of other dynamics that contributes to poor well-being or mental health concerns. When we look at the social injustices and the civic unrest that's happened in our region and across our country, and certainly even globally, we've seen these experiences. It is almost impossible for any of us to avoid that. Every last one of us have been impacted, whether we have been impacted directly, or 6 degrees of separation, or just simply by the images that have been flooded through social media, as we've all been forced to be in this remote capacity and really begin to filter our world through the images that we see, and how we embrace getting information, how we even network with one another has shifted our very lens and the very narratives about how we see the world. And so, when Dr. Field talked about this collective complex trauma, I want to introduce another term for us, in that we begin to think about collective disturbance. And what I mean by that is very similar in terms of thinking about complex trauma. When things are happening and all of us begin to formulate a narrative, but maybe a faulty narrative because of the way we're experiencing things, it creates this collective disturbance. And we can all probably agree that we have seen that play out in many different dynamics as we watch the horror and the images around the loss of life with Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. And when we saw this abrupt paradigm shift in terms of how we really embraced our normal to what we all now refer to as the new normal. All of these things create potentially a collective disturbance about how we're filtering information, how we even filter our emotions. And as Dr. Field talked about, relationships are so key in helping us begin to filter that lens and help us really create that sense of resiliency and stability about how we manage our day, things that we have been exposed to. If we just looked at, for example, the social justice issues around the racial disparity that we witness, we see this collective disturbance that has been embedded over generations and historically around systemic racism, around discriminatory practices, and not simply just with people of color or African Americans, but even with other cultural groups such as LGBTQA. And those are, dynamics that, we have to begin to, question, how do we begin to respond to this? And how do we make meaning out of that in terms of being able to embrace social justice actions? What are the implications about how we see our living conditions, how we embrace learning opportunities or learning conditions, and then also just in general, how are we looking at workplace environment and how we're embracing one another? And so when we see that there may be potential injustices, can we rally around something that allows us to make sense of our world, our worldview, meaning how we see the world and how we think the world sees us? And so when you have people have experienced that or feel that they align with that, or people see them in that context, then that may reaffirm or reinforce this thinking that may create a sense of feeling unsettled, feeling unsafe. And the narrative, therefore, is that everything else is filtered through that lens. And so looking at opportunities in terms of how we create healing in our communities, how we look at using our platforms, whether we're talking about pedagogy in terms of teaching and instruction, whether we're looking at our communities and empowerment opportunities. Can we look at legislative or other kinds of regulatory things that would help reinforce infrastructures that allow us to navigate this culture in a more successful way and be more thoughtful about it? Whatever it is, we do know that trauma is linked to racism and it's linked to social injustices. And we know that those things have adverse mental health and physical implications for people. We can go and look at the research and the literature, and it will demonstrate for us that that is a real factor that we need to take a look at. And if we're going to move towards a place of well-being and community healing, then we cannot ignore those dynamics that's happened in this tridemic, if you will, over the past several months. And we're looking at the summer of discontent, but honestly, we're looking at the discontent, which really came to a head with issues that have gone on for many years, with the exception of the physical pandemic. But when we start to look at specialized populations, we know that those disparities already existed there. There were healthcare issues or that were challenged. It just became more of a global factor. And so these are some things that we want to look at. One of the things I guess I want to say when we think about social justice as well is that we have to also take a look at some of the outcomes or implications like domestic violence or community violence. What we see in terms of, Dr. Field talked about opiate use or substance abuse use. When we see that those things are increasing, they cannot be looked at, or we can't talk about social justice without looking at those things and talk about mental health, because there are direct impact around that. And so as we have further discussion today, I'd love to have more conversation about the things and the resources and the strategies that we can take that will counter those negative experiences that we all collectively have had, and that we look at in terms of the disturbance that it brings about in our daily relationships, in our work life, and our ability to cope with the trauma and the challenges that we've all experienced as a result of the tridemic.
Thank you, Jelaine and Adrian, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm super stressed out, by the way, just letting you all know. I'm like feeling this, I'm carrying it up here. And thank you for inviting me also to this panel. And I'm coming in from the art therapy profession kind of angle. Also, I think it would be good to identify that I'm a new faculty. I'm also thinking of myself as a colleague to, some of our students and anyone who's in the field or kind of like in between places. Also as a white presenting Latina in a new state and a new region, because all of that comes in to inform my viewpoints. And the tridemic, and I love the term, Jelaine, I put it in, the tridemic is certainly impacted me personally, and I've seen it impact my family as well, because in this region, we felt very cut off from our natural or have become natural experiences, especially raising small children. And now we've been cut off from family and traditional support systems. And so in thinking about this discussion, this panel, I kept thinking, this is so challenging to focus on just one area of mental health when we're just dealing with so much. So it's like compounded and chronic situations, because it's not just one thing. And I think that what we're seeing has the potential to be very much a paradigm shift. And I'm glad Dr. Dixon brought that into her discussion in how we see the world and also how we are engaging the world. The spring and the summer forced a lot of traditionally face-to-face and hands-on services to be reconceptualized for the digital environment overnight. I remember the phone call I got where we had to jump. It was a Sunday. We jumped online. We're like, what are we going to do? We can no longer meet our students. And it was right after, I think it was like my birthday. I was like, oh, okay. And we did, as a program and as a department, we kind of rallied and we changed things quite quickly. The art therapy profession as a whole has struggled with this change and is continuing to work on it again as a whole. And as a program, I think moving online has provided increased accessibility to very non-traditional students that would not have been able to access our services, to mental health consumers. So we're seeing a lot more consumers actually being able to participate in services because they need it, but also because now they can, whereas before they couldn't access a traditional brick and mortar service, as well as others needing and or looking to connect. And online spaces, I feel, when they're nurtured and nurtured well, can form these small niches, these small communities that contribute to the mental health and wellness of its participants. And as a profession and department, we continue to have these conversations about how can we make these spaces better for everyone. So as new things come up, we make changes happen so that they're not stagnant, so that we are speaking about current events, so that we are addressing current discomforts. And this is a balance, and it is challenging, but it is something we welcome. I know for ourselves at EU, we're doing the art therapy virtual studio since the spring, since that day in March. And we've carried it on through the summer, and we're continuing to carry it on through the fall. And we're looking forward to making it just a part of the program where it is a space for healing and for wellness. We've seen students, we've seen moms, students with their moms, we've seen faculty members, we've seen partners that come in and actually stay, that don't just run away. We've seen roommates, we've seen children, students with their children, as well as colleagues. And we welcome everybody. We suggest people just share our information so that they can come in. If they have someone in another place that they can't get to, we'll meet at the studio and create together or have these difficult discussions together. And so some come for support and some come for dialogue and some just to check it out and see what it's about. And that's okay. We're very welcoming. And we encourage those dialogues about, the Juneteenth, about BLM, about Pride, and the LGBTQIA+ experience. And we've had special events around those topics, but those topics are things that we are okay talking about anytime, not during just special dates. And the studio is something, like I said, that will continue. And if anyone's interested to speak about it or to kind of, touch base about it, just hit me up, I guess. Find my email and shoot me an email, and I'll be glad to discuss further, the sorts of things that we cover there.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here with you and with my colleagues, and I just want to spend a few minutes supplementing the observations and comments of my colleagues by focusing on the political context of the summer of 2020, maybe 2020 as a whole. The first thing is that I would say that this year, 2020, is distinct, highly distinct in two ways. One, it is highly distinct in having several major controversies and events occurring within a very short time frame and impacting one another. And the tridemic, certainly, and related economic issues, but also the political atmosphere in which we're living right now and what we're experiencing right now. Starting with an impeachment trial early in the year and sort of tests of the limits of democracy and constitutional power or limitations. The current election season, which has amplified and perhaps made more difficult discussions around all of these very real issues and crises, which again, sort of cascading on top of one another. And we're in an atmosphere, generally speaking, of incredible toxic polarization and political discourse. And the current president, regardless of what one thinks of his specific policy prescriptions, definitely has decided strategically that increasing toxicity and around political discourse is strategically powerful for him, and it is having to some extent an impact. And then just on top of everything else going on politically, economically, and so on, we've had extreme climate events. So it is truly a sort of a once in 100 years year, but with 6 or 7 major events that are usually century-like events. So that's one way in which this current year is incredibly distinct. The second way in which this year is distinct is it's distinct for each one of us. There's not really, we're all witnessing the same events, but there's not a singular 2020 experience, because we each have a variety of lived experiences based on how we're situated in the society, personally and historically, and as part of different communities. Just as an example, and again, it's a fairly obvious example, the sort of multiplicative impacts of all of these events, the pandemic, economic crash, continuing structural racism, of which extralegal killing of African Americans is just one example. The multiplicative impacts of these events fall harder on certain communities, communities of color, poorer communities, women, and again, the intersection of those communities. And the fact that we have distinct lived experiences as individuals and as communities makes constructive discourse around solutions to the problems we have, or even sort of framing the discussion around the issues that we're seeing more difficult. And there are additional challenges because many people or communities are in bubbles. We live in geographic bubbles, economic bubbles. We live in information consumption bubbles. That is exacerbated by the pandemic because as my colleagues have mentioned, our basic capacity for human interaction is limited, and we are engaging in increased mediation or distortion of discussion through social media, which is a technology that we haven't quite caught up to in terms of its widespread impact on the way we sort of live and think and again communicate with one another. And we feel like we're in a crisis in many ways because we are experiencing multiple crises, but also I do think there are some opportunistic mischaracterizations of crises that exist in society. And so people are in a heightened state of alert. And again, I'm not a psychologist, but as a general matter politically, when we are in a crisis situation, there is a human incentive to see other people as one-dimensional or view them one-dimensionally, and to propose resulting simplistic and perhaps radical solutions to problems, again, which is not constructive in the long term. So this is a very challenging, and again, I'm telling you something I'm sure you already know, but this is a very challenging year in multiple reasons, but politically. But all that being noted, I have what I think is good news. I have some mixed news, and then I have a couple of suggestions. And the good news is not every year is like this. If those of you who are the college students and are watching this, participating in this event, it's possible you're coming into full political consciousness for the first time, or this is the time of your life where you're going to be coming into full political consciousness, and this is not normal. And so, the feeling that everything is unstable, everything is at stake, will eventually subside to an extent. And that can actually be in some sense counterproductive because we can get comfortable, and the things that perhaps some of us are privileged to ignore or minimize can actually impede necessary or evolutionary change. But as a general matter, a sustained state of crisis is not good for long-term political evolution or stability. So this year will end, even if it's not necessarily the calendar year 2020, or necessarily end with this upcoming presidential election. So that's the good news. Things will stabilize a bit. But the mixed news is that the major issues that we see playing out are not going away. Certainly not all at once. And what we're seeing in this year is a series of long-standing issues coming to a boil simultaneously. And while that overlap is distinct to this year, those issues aren't going to be resolved fully with the calendar turning to 2021. So that's good in the sense that I think if we haven't been conscious before, we are fully conscious that there are multiple major cultural, ideological, political, and structural issues that have to be resolved. They just absolutely have to be addressed. And that's good. So we're sort of, these things are on our agenda, and it's hard for us to look away, even if perhaps that's tempting. But it also means that for all of us as individuals in a society, especially a democratic society where we limit the government's power in exchange for, or in reliance on, us engaging in active self-governance and responsible citizenship, the responsible use of our freedoms, we have to negotiate within ourselves and then with others. We have to negotiate how we want to play a role as political actors in this society and kind of address the great traumas that and issues that we have that are longstanding and again continuing. And so that's a question we have to ask all of ourselves. Each one of us has to have this conversation with ourselves. What role do we want to play? How can we be political in a way that's realistic and healthy for us, but is consistent with and contributes to our own life goals that we have for ourselves and for our families and for our communities. Those are not easy questions to answer. And again, it's especially because there's not one right answer. We're all situated differently, and we all have to think about how we negotiate our role as political actors with our own life challenges and opportunities and privileges. So what are some of the things that we can do as political actors in 2020? It's possible that, based on our own personal sort of situatedness in society, it's possible that the most important thing, or the thing that we can do that takes up most of our energy, is simply surviving on a day-to-day basis, living as stable a life as we can on a day-to-day basis, and living with dignity to the degree that we can. For many people, again, the cascading impacts of this year are so overwhelming that to be thinking of oneself as a political actor and engaging in political activism of various sorts may be too much. And so I just wanted to emphasize, from my own perspective as a political analyst, living a life of safety and dignity can itself be a powerful political statement, and can be exactly what a person needs to do in a given moment or in a given period of a person's life. But to the degree that you feel comfortable and capable and desiring of going beyond that sort of living with dignity and that sort of surviving with dignity, I would say that there are two basic things that anybody can do that are kind of foundational for effective political action in a democratic society. And again, it's going to sound pretty basic, but they're all something that we can do, and they're also things that we can kind of do for free. One is simply being a skeptical, subtle consumer of accurate information. Not always easy to do in our current political environment, but being a consumer of accurate information, to the degree we have to find it, and then we have to be skeptical and subtle thinkers about it, is powerful. And again, it can be challenging, but it's really important that we collectively try and get out of again, our sort of information consumption bubbles. And if you reach out to me after this event, I'm happy to provide you with some documents that I've put together about consuming the news and ways of thinking about consuming the news, and how we sort of interact with that information in a way that feels constructive. One of the tools of authoritarian regimes and authoritarian cultures is that they encourage us to give up on trying to find out what is accurate information. That is, that they muddy the waters so much that we give up. And when we give up on seeking accuracy and being skeptical, then what we rely on are our base prejudices. So we have to have a commitment in a democratic society to pursuing accurate information skeptically and subtly. And the second thing is to pursue what I would call discussion and not argument. We're a great argumentative society, and perhaps political scientists like me contribute to that, or political actors contribute to that. But really what I mean is that we should, the more that we discuss things with people, meaning that we are open to being proven wrong, and we're open to listening to people, we're open to seeing people as complex, multifaceted human beings. The human condition is that people are simultaneously capable of incredible generosity, loving, and incredibly good actions, but also the exact same person can be subject to prejudice, ignorance, and cruelty. And wrestling with that paradox in human beings, rather than seeing each other as one-dimensional, and having the ability to talk with people in a way that is discussion-based, is powerful. And again, it's the foundation of political connectedness in a democratic society. Denouncing people, denouncing bad ideas, denouncing evil is powerful and important. But the right balance of denunciation, of political combat, and then open and democratic discussion is very important. And again, it's something I'd be happy to talk to all of you about in more detail. So that's what I'll say for now. And again, I'm so happy to be here and looking forward to further discussion.
All right, thank you, Dr. Fisher. We have a couple of questions that have come through since we've been presenting. So what I want to do is to take a quick moment just to kind of frame things. And when I ask these questions, they're kind of open to everybody on the floor. I mean, everybody here has different viewpoints. So anybody that feels comfortable answering these, and like Dr. Fisher said, we will provide any sort of information that's requested. If you have any questions following this, for sure, we'd love to. Sometimes in these public sessions, questions might be hidden, or you might be not as energetic to project them. So it might be able to do something privately. So that's fine too. We'll be available definitely. The question that came in for anybody, any one of our panelists, is around the summer's events and underrepresented and minority students. So what are your thoughts on the different impact that these stressors might have on specific underrepresented and minority students in ways that their non-minority students wouldn't be as affected? So how is that affecting minority students, and how do you see that happening specifically on a college campus?
Well, one of the things I guess I will start off maybe by responding to that is that when we look at students who are underrepresented, they may actually come from communities who have had historical, generational experiences. And so these events might reinforce more this lens and narrative around feeling unsafe and feeling unprotected and undignified, for lack of a better word. And so that may be, and I think as Dr. Fisher talked about, our experiences, our own individual experiences and lived experiences are different. So young people who are coming out of these communities may not feel safe. And so it may have additional ripples. And again, the research supports this in terms of their general mental health, their sense of well-being, their sense of who they are and their identity and how they conceptualize themselves, as well as their ability in terms of performance from learning environments that, again, these things play out in their ability to concentrate and how they're able to embrace that. So we do know that it has the potential for more negative outcome on those young people, particularly if they come from communities where they've experienced systemic racism or discriminatory practices, or even perception that there are those things. So whether or not they actually have existed, if there's this perception, we know that that can be just as powerful as if they have experienced it. And those things can lead to stronger ripples in terms of their sense of well-being and their ability to connect and develop those key relationships that may help them filter and be able to navigate this intense and really difficult environment.
Dr. Mitchell, you wanted to chime in on that, or did you have another question?
So one of the things I have concerned, I come from a different perspective. My background is student affairs. So I'm concerned about how when students are back face to face with each other, how students of color and students who are gay and lesbian, students who are demonstrating, who are living any difference in their lived experience. I think that sometimes people are going to have an expectation that they be experts who explain to people why their experience is different. I think that's an added layer of complication in trying to rebuild social interactions with peers who they're sitting in the classrooms with. I think as well-intended as we are as faculty, I think that sometimes faculty may say, well, what was your experience like? And talk to me about why your experience was different or more important than the experience of those of your peers who are non-unrepresented people in the classroom. We already know that occurs when we don't have stressors. So us as a campus community being aware that that's a possibility, we need to be really careful about how we help guide the students through those things. These things have been, we have 4 experts here, and they've really wonderfully captured a lot of the ideas that I had around what's been going on this summer. But imagine, a group of 4 18-year-olds trying to have the same conversation, and all of them having the same passion that we all have around our concerns, and then being questioned by peers who haven't had the same experience, but who have also had a very difficult summer too. Why was your experience any more impactful than mine? I think that's one of the things that people in my field are really concerned with. And I think that's something we all need to be aware of. I have some questions for the panel later on, but that's where I spend a lot of my thoughts. I've really been thinking a lot about young people, and I've really tried to put a lot of messages about self-care out there, because for those of us who are older, we never expected to see things like this in our lifetime. My daughter talked to me, and I do refer to my daughter a lot. She talked to me about that for their generation, all they've known are stressors since they've been growing up. There's been really big things going on. Her grandmother experienced Hurricane Katrina, and she talked about it as a very young kid, how that impacted her. She said almost every 4 years there's been some major stressor for them. So they're not growing up the way she describes it is, it's hard for us to be hopeful. So if those young people didn't come back to campus and they're all confronting each other, I think we need to be prepared for, there'll be tension that we'll have to manage, we'll have to help them through. Thank you.
Great points, Terrence, and I just want to piggyback a little bit on that in terms of having a conversation. And I think whether we're in a classroom or whether we're in a counseling session or our work environments, and even in our personal relationships, that part of what we're learning out of this is to really press ourselves or push ourselves to reach out and really to experience one another, and we may have to do it in different contexts, but to really make sure, and I think Dr. Field really tried to stress this earlier, how important those relationships are and having the conversation is, and that those are the things that's going to help mitigate and decrease some of the anxiety and stress that go along with all of this, irregardless of what domain we're talking about. But if we're not doing that, then we're likely to have more negative experiences.
And I think it's related. That's why I keep thinking about it. But something that happened to us in the summer in the studio was I wanted to reach out to the Latinx community, and I created events for the studio that were based around this community. And then I realized, like, we are not really capturing them. We're not attracting them, because the minute classes went online or everything became like distant and they didn't have to be physically on their various campuses, it's very true. Like, everyone went back to work. Everyone had to do full-time jobs, and they were no longer accessible with their time to just do, something that's for self-care. They couldn't just pop in on like a midday session that was for their own well-being. They had to think about the money coming in. They had to think about their families now. And I think, now in the fall, we might see some more of that. Those students may or may not feel comfortable reaching out to the faculty saying, well, now since we're still fully online, I can't be in class. Is it okay? What other alternative do I have so I can still perform while maintaining a full-time job that maybe I didn't have to have when I did have to come to class?
All right, do we have any more thoughts on that question? I know Dr. Mitchell, you had a question to pose to the panelists, so let's turn it over to Dr. Mitchell.
So like I said, I really admire all of you and really appreciate all of you participating. So I wanted you to think about for a moment with me, I'm an awkward student affairs guy. So one of the things I get concerned about is, I think that when people come back, I read an article that said that one of the biggest concerns that the author of the article had was not so much our financial resources or our opportunities to come back. They said, I think we'll get by that. People always have found a way to make ends meet. But what they talked about was that they believe that we're really going to all be as socially awkward as we are online. And that'll be such a different way of interacting. He believes it might happen for 10 years, where we're all just gonna be a really socially awkward nation. We're not gonna wanna hug each other. We're not gonna wanna touch each other. We're gonna stand 6 feet apart because that's just what we've gotten used to. There'll be some people who are really, really gregarious people, be really ready to do all those things. But even with me, this summer I visited my mother and she wanted to hug me. And I was like, thinking about that, I could carry a disease to her. I stood feet apart. That was hard for her because she was an older person. So the way we interact with our senior citizens, the way we interact with our children, all those things will be changed. And that's where my concern comes back when we come back to face to face. I wanted all of you to share possibly 1 or 2 concerns you have about what might happen when we come back face to face. If it be either yourself, for your community, for your students, for your family, that I think would help the viewing audience get a better idea of who we are and what are we thinking about for our future at Edinburgh. And so, and this is the way I like to do it. Julaine, you started the conversation. If you could start, and then let's move through the progression like we did before. I think that'd be great.
I'm thinking, Terrence, I'm thinking about your question, and I think I'm struggling with focusing on students coming back because I've taught online since I started at Edinburgh. I've never had the opportunity to teach a face-to-face course at the university. So making it work online and building relationships with students in class, whether it's synchronous, asynchronous, is part of what I have to do every semester to be successful and to feel connected to my classes and for my students to feel connected to me. I, speaking for myself, do not have a lot of concerns about us coming back to campus and being able to rebound and find ways to relate to each other, to be around each other, and to really celebrate the chance to connect face to face again. I think, speaking for myself, I really miss people, and I've shared that sentiment out loud, and many other people have reciprocated that they miss people. So I'm not sure that I'm overly concerned right now about us not being able to rebound, about us not being able to be relationally resilient and come back together and maximize face-to-face time together. So that's where I am today.
And as I think about the question, I guess, again, I think for me, I'm not necessarily overly concerned about the return, but how we recalibrate and how we look to rethink how we connect and making sure that we do it in a safe manner. And so how do we come back and make sure we're maintaining, if we're still under these conditions that 6 feet apart, or how we navigate the kinds of things that we would historically have done to connect with one another and to build those relationships and to also sustain those relationships. And so to me, it's not necessarily a worry, but making sure that we are consciously, intentionally thinking about how we go about doing that. And I think, Dr. Field brings up a great point. For those, all of us have been forced to teach online and to engage one another as well as students online. And so figuring out ways that when we do come back to the brick and mortar, how do we do it in a responsive way that, again, fosters those connections and those relationships, but is just mindful of the dynamics that have occurred, and how do we model that for students and for one another, so that we can continue to build on those relationships and those dynamics. And so there's expectations based on our own experiences that we want to do and that we have about what relationships look like, and we're all kind of reconfiguring that in terms of social context. So even our young people, from dating to engaging with one another. I mean, the way in which I love to take care of people is, bake something for them, or, engage with them. And you have to be mindful of that. So instead, I'm eating the stuff I'm baking, and, instead of being able to share it, because you don't want people to feel at risk or to be compromised about it. So we just have to recalibrate. How do we do things in which we can pour in and invest to people and emotionally embrace them in ways that don't necessarily involve, hugging and touching the way we would have traditionally done it. And I think a lot of it will drive what occurs over the next few months about how we can come back together safely in a physical context. A lot of that will drive how we begin to look at those relationships and reestablish those dynamics.
Wow. Okay, so I've thought about this question, though I've never heard it before, a ton. And that's because before the decision had been made to go fully online, we had an open studio, which was a physical studio on campus. And so I immediately started thinking about all the different populations. It's not open to just students. Like, community members would come. We had some elderly individuals come. We had classes of itty bitty kids come through it at least once a day, 2 days a week. And I kept thinking, like, those are populations that I need to watch out for. Like, I can't have people sharing all the materials within a studio without keeping an eye and without counting and without cleaning in this new space. You know what I mean? Like now, if when we go back in, we're going to have to put up some parameters to keep everybody as safe as possible. Because I mean, if you're around kids, they're petri dishes, to be honest. And we all need to be safe, but it is a place of community. And I would like to continue to foster that community in such spaces.
I think I would say maybe I'm less concerned, more curious. And again, thinking specifically about the kind of things that we do in my own classes. There are certain types of political action, which, I mean, all types of political action carry risk, but having a discussion about politics where you kind of go upstream and think about people's deeper feelings and presuppositions about life and the big questions, which then produce these kind of downstream conclusions about politics and things. To do that, there's a kind of a vulnerability in that, right? In having discussions, especially if you're worried someone's going to say, well, you're wrong, and we've been taught in polite society to not talk about politics and religion, and one of the things that I that's a pet peeve of mine. But the point is that there is a way of kind of in the online environment, there's a way of possibly hiding or hiding from one's vulnerability about politics, because extemporaneous conversation, when you're right in a person's physical presence and you're going back and forth dynamically, that requires a certain type of, again, a comfort level with vulnerability. Whereas in a more iterative process where there's time, that can also be very great for having thoughtful discussions, like old letters going back and forth. You have time to think about your response and so on. I'm not so much worried about it, but curious that the students who are having a couple of years of experience during these formative years of having discussions about deep issues in primarily an iterative way, how they essentially will, transition to extemporaneous and in-person conversation, and how that might be difficult for them, and how that might influence then the way in which they practice politics and the way they think about what's a constructive form of interaction with other people. And so again, I think that's something that I'm curious to see how it kind of works once the undergrad students get back into face-to-face classes primarily.
One of the things I'm going to do to help those viewers who have been watching this afterwards on Instagram and on Facebook, I'll have some quotes from this discussion. I'll have links to the video afterwards. I've asked Chris LaFleur to come back in because I'm not the best at doing closings. But I'm going to end by saying, all of you, thank you so much for sharing all your insights with us. I believe this was a powerful discussion. I'm looking forward to, we have about 5 more to go this semester. So please follow us on those discussions. And thank you again. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. Like I said, all of our panelists will be available. We have their email addresses, which we can add to the comments, and we can add to the information on Facebook. We will have follow-up information. Dr. Fisher has a list of sources. We have all sorts of ideas that we can share with everybody. We wanted to thank Dr. Terrence Mitchell and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and all of our panelists here today, Dr. Sheila Lorenzo de la Pena, Dr. Adrian Dixon, Dr. Julian Field, Dr. Jim Fisher, and Dr. Terrence Mitchell. So on behalf of Edinburgh University, thank you so much for joining us for this first diversity dialogue. We will be with you with the next session. We look forward to having you. So everybody take care. We will have, for the students who are watching, we will have representatives from the Gehring Health Center available throughout the day. If there are any concepts that may have led you to want to speak to somebody or any issues that you still want to discuss. So thank you so much, and everybody have a great day.